dedicated to renewing the centre-right for the next generation. Over the past year, I've led a programme called Getting to Zero, co-chaired by Dame Caroline Spellman and Caroline Flint, seeking to dig into the major practical and political challenges of the net zero transition. But of course, we're not here for me. We're here today for a major speech by one of the most important people in the climate debate in the UK. And this speech comes at a pivotal moment in our pursuit of decarbonisation. The policy world is really waiting at the moment in bated breath for some crucial government documents, including the Treasury's net zero review, the net zero strategy, of course, and the heat and building strategy. And there are some really crucial questions that need to be addressed in those documents, particularly the question of how to fund the transition and how to diffuse major technologies such as heat pumps across the country. And I'm really excited to hear Chris's thoughts on how we tackle some of those barriers, those specific barriers. And on top of this, at the moment, we've got the whole world looking at us as the host of the 26th Conference of Parties in Glasgow in November, and to discuss these issues and more, I'm really delighted to introduce a man who has been instrumental in steering the climate change debate in the UK for a number of years, and that is, of course, Chris Stark. So Chris is the Chief Executive of the government's key advisors in this debate, the Climate Change Committee, and he had a pivotal role in the publication of the CCC's Net Zero report, which resulted in a net zero target being signed into law back in 2019. He also more recently led the landmark sixth carbon budget, which was signed up to in full by the government at the end of last year. And I think it's fair to say that the Climate Change Committee we have here really is the envy of the world, and it really is a sort of exemplar of how to tackle climate change from a policy perspective. So we are really thrilled to have Chris here today for his take on where we're at on the road to net zero, and also what really needs to be done to put us on track. And just before we get started, so just some housekeeping. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Chris for his speech, and after that, we will have a question and answer session. So just to make sure that your questions are asked as well, please do ask them early and put them in the Q&A function, not in the chat function, as some do. And as I'll be ending the session promptly at 3 p.m. as well. So I know Chris has a very busy diary, so please do get those questions in early, so to make sure that they've been asked. So without further ado, I would like to turn to Chris Stark for his speech entitled Net Zero, Ensuring an Achievable Transition. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks so much. Very, very pleased to join you today, and very pleased to give this speech from Glasgow. This is my last week in Glasgow working from here, so I should be back to London next week, so very exciting time. Now, I want to kick off by saying from the top, I'm not a politician, though this job is one that regularly thrusts me into politics. I try very hard to keep my own political views separate from my job, so it's very much a case that that's for the polling booth and the pub. But in this talk, I do intend to cover some of the practicalities of the transition to net zero for the UK. And since the practicalities involve a hell of a lot of policy making and leadership by governments, particularly over the next decade or so, it's going to be hard to avoid some of those political statements. So let me acknowledge from the top that the current politics of net zero are certainly becoming very, very interesting, and they are clearly increasingly contested. And for my money, that is probably a good thing. There is the science. The science is very clear about the importance of net zero in stopping future temperature rise. I would argue, therefore, that the end goal here is largely predetermined, but we definitely need more debate about the means of achieving net zero. And frankly, I don't think we've had enough of that debate, enough of that scrutiny of the many, many choices that are before us here in the UK. And it's not just this country, of course, it's other countries around the world. When net zero became law in 2019, when the sixth carbon budget became law earlier this year, those were both on the strength of the advice that my organisation provided, the CCC advice. And pleased as I am about that, I think it was a mistake not to put it to a vote in Parliament on both occasions. I am fairly certain that a vote would have demonstrated that there was a political consensus continuing in this country and in Parliament for acting on this. I think that would have renewed the democratic mandate for the changes ahead. And I think we should always be prepared to test and indeed retest the political will to pursue the course. So more of that later. We're going to come on to some of that in this talk. Nonetheless, I think the UK is now committed to the right path. We have already decarbonised faster than most other countries, certainly in the G20. That is due to UK policy making, due to the efforts that we have been pursuing in the UK, but it is still far too slow. So today, I think the key thing for me is to stick to the very practical concern of achieving the legal targets that this country now has. They happen to commit the UK to a steep and I think very achievable trajectory for emissions. And I'll try my best, of course, in that discussion to maintain that political neutrality, as you'd expect from me. So today I want to try and talk about four things. I'll start with a discussion of why net zero. Why do we have this target of net zero? To review the science a little, perhaps also to counter some of Sadita Helm's arguments in a previous Onward speech, which I also tuned into. Secondly, what's required to achieve net zero in the UK? So sticking rigidly, of course, to my apolitical stance, but what must happen if we're going to get to net zero? Thirdly, how might it be achieved? This is the more contentious stuff, the policy challenge before us, a warm-up, I suppose, to the forthcoming net zero strategy that we expect from the government in the next few months. And lastly, on the economics of the transition, right back to the heart of the current political squabble. I'll try and stick to the facts on that to highlight why I think this is a genuinely achievable transition and indeed one that's worthwhile. So let's begin with the first of these and the question of why we have this 2050 net zero target in the UK. And we talked a lot about this 2 years ago, but it's worth recovering. Net zero is, of course, a scientific goal. It's the point when you've matched any emissions with active removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The importance of that is it's an absolute red line issue at the global scale in the science. That is the point when we stop warming the planet. And we can see that most obviously in the remarkable report we had from the IPCC just a few weeks ago. The IPCC brought together multiple lines of new evidence, new observations, new sets of simulations. And what they've given us, and crucially what they've given for COP26, is a far, far more robust outlook on the physical science of climate change. They are extremely clear now on where we stand. The world is now warmer than it has been for the last at least 125,000 years. We are seeing unprecedented rates of warming compared to any time in the last 2,000 years at least. And crucially, it is unequivocal, in their words, unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land. Thanks, of course, to the near linear relationship between carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and warming. So all of that, of course, is very troubling. But of course, what the IPCC also said is that getting to net zero carbon dioxide globally will stop further warming. So net zero CO2 by 2050 is going to be necessary if we want to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Again, that's a global challenge. That is the kind of clarity we need from our scientists, I would suggest. And they also said if we can go further and achieve net zero for the broader basket of greenhouse gas emissions beyond carbon dioxide, and that is the harder basis of the UK's own target here domestically, including gases like methane, then temperature change should even start to slowly go into reverse, which of course is another thing that we may wish to see in the future years. So net zero is the global goal. It is a fundamental, or we are going to see dangerous changes in climate, continuation of the extreme weather that we have already started to see. And that is something I think that few now dispute. And that is great. We're in a good position when it comes to that. Why then make it a goal for the UK? After all, aren't we responsible for just a tiny fraction of total global emissions? Well, let me try and put to you 4 good reasons for having that net zero target of 2050 in the UK. First, we are signatory to the Paris Agreement, and that does require countries to set emissions goals that are consistent with what they call their highest possible ambition. Now, this is not, I would suggest, a unilateral target, therefore. It's a shared endeavour. It's also a duty under that accord. But I personally don't find that very compelling as an argument alone. So the second reason is that we are capable of achieving net zero. And I think this is absolutely fundamental, as we will discuss, and that we are capable of doing so ahead of the global average required by the Paris Agreement. That is what we're doing by setting that 2050 goal for all greenhouse gases in the UK. In the Climate Change Act, of course, we also have the stable institutional framework, legal framework to achieve all of that. And we have the capacity and the resources to support it. So we should. And if we can't, or if we won't in this country, with all of our natural and economic advantages, then I don't think there's much hope for other territories to do the same thing. So the second issue is about capability. The third is about equity. We have a large historical contribution to the problem of climate change, and we have consumption patterns at the moment that mean that we are responsible for significant carbon emissions elsewhere in the world, just as Dieter Helm says very compellingly. So I think there is a strong equity argument for having a territorial target that is ahead of the global average again. And we have that now with our net zero 2050 target for all greenhouse gases. That is some 20 years ahead of the global date for all greenhouse gases if we're to stay on the path for Paris. So the third reason is for that domestic target is global equity. But the fourth reason, and the much more compelling reason, I think, is that setting and achieving net zero in the UK supports the global effort directly. It cajoles others to do the same. Making the argument for other countries to join that net zero club becomes harder and harder to resist by the UK taking this path and others too. And in so doing, we are lowering the competitiveness barriers that come with that transition and lowering, hopefully, the global cost of this transition. So driving the pace of technological change here in the UK, ensuring ultimately that developing countries can benefit from the resulting cost falls that come from those key technologies too. In the end, it's the argument that we in the UK can drive down the cost of this and see economic benefit from doing it that I personally find much more compelling than all the others. I believe we will benefit from leading certain aspects of this transition in this country, especially those areas, obviously, where we have the comparative advantage. That's exactly what we've been doing in offshore wind in this country. It is now the cheapest form of electricity generation on a levelized cost basis. And of course, that will deliver in turn, in due course, a benefit for other countries around the world who have those offshore wind resources and want to exploit them at that cheaper price. So that is what I hope will happen with hydrogen in this country. That is what I hope will happen with carbon capture. There are other stories where I think the UK can really capitalize. So I don't think Net Zero UK is a unilateral target, as some have suggested. It has an effect on others. It ripples out. And since the UK decision to set net zero in law, we've seen the French do the same. We've seen the EU. We've seen the Asian economies, China, the US. The club of economies that now sits underneath net zero by mid-century as a goal probably amounts to something close to 80% now of global GDP, depending on how you calculate that. That is big progress. And actually in a very short space of time. That is exactly what we argued we could help with in 2019 in recommending that the UK set that net zero goal. I'm pleased we were right about that. Net zero has snowballed as a concept as the confidence to go for it has grown, including the commercial now commitments to net zero too. It is true to say, though, that we have a larger carbon footprint in this country than those emissions we produce solely at home, just as Dieter Helm says. It is also true to say, though, that as other economies around the world join that net zero club, those consumption emissions beyond our borders that we are responsible for will fall. In fact, if the world follows a Paris trajectory, as I hope it will, we will reduce total UK consumption emissions by 90% when it gets to 2050. And of course, we will have brought our territorial emissions to net zero too. So I think it is the right target. It sets the right message, sends that out to other countries. And other countries clearly feel the same way, including notably China with their 2060 net zero goal. I fundamentally believe it will have economic advantages to the UK as well, and probably geopolitical advantages as well, especially as we become more energy independent as a country on the way to net zero. More of that in a moment. But of course, the key thing is that net zero has to be actually achieved in practice. Targets are fine, but they're only on paper. And that's the rub, of course. So on then to the second of the four parts that I'll cover in my speech today. What is required to achieve net zero in the UK? And here I might begin with just a short tale of the progress we've made in the UK over the last 30 years. So if you look at the emissions progress since 1990 in this country, emissions produced in the UK have fallen by over 40%. The pandemic makes it difficult to be precise about exactly how much, but it is over 40%. It's slightly reductionist to say it, but it comes down broadly to three things. The first is that we have become an increasingly service-based economy. We did in the past offshore heavy industry from the UK, but we actually did that quite a long time ago, mostly pre-1990. It is more that we've retained the manufacturing capacity that we have for the last 30 years, but grown the lower emission service firms and sectors alongside that. So that has helped, of course. Number two is that we've become much more energy efficient as an economy. And that is down ultimately to technological progress and I would say regulation over especially the products that we buy. Think of all the flat screen tellies, all the aerated fridges. There is not enough said about that, actually. It's a big part of the progress we've made in the UK so far. And third, we have clearly done the right things in our power sector. We have closed coal. We've moved to lower carbon and flexible natural gas. We've moved to renewables. We've brought down their cost progressively through some strong policies. We have maintained nuclear output at about 20% of the mix over that period. The UK coal story is really impressive. It stands out because other countries haven't done it. So it's the UK policy framework that has driven most of that progress, coupled, of course, with a strong response from a willing energy sector. So we will now close the final coal plant in the UK in 2024, and that will be quite a moment when that happens. But of course, what that means is that we're now entering a new chapter. In fact, we're probably already in that chapter. And the implication of that is that the next 30 years are going to be very different to the last 30. And in December, we in the CCC laid out 5 different scenarios for achieving net zero in full over the course of the next 30 years. Each of those scenarios was very different. It was designed to illustrate that there was more than one way to skin this particular cat. And we chose what we would regard as a balanced set of assumptions for the pathway that was then used to determine the emissions targets that have become UK law. But we also explored, it's worth saying, a pathway with lots of behaviour change, quite an extreme pathway there, a pathway with lots of technological progress, the innovation scenario that we looked at, again, a fairly extreme scenario, and a pathway where we're more stubborn to change, so our use of fossil fuels remains. And they all get to net zero. They are all quite different in their makeup, but they all have the same overall shape for emissions over the next 30 years. And that shape is an inverted S. So if you can imagine the path of emissions over the next 30 years and an inverted S, the first part of that pathway, the first decade is the plateau. So progress in the next 10 years is going to be slower than we might like it to be. That's because we will have finished the job on coal and we have to scale up the effort in all the other sectors that haven't been decarbonising to date. Then over the 2030s, in all of our scenarios, the pace really picks up as the zero carbon assets especially flow into the economy. More on that in a second throughout every sector. And then finally, we slow again, come to another plateau in the 2040s as the last sources of emissions are tackled. Broadly, that's what needs to happen overall. Beneath that, there are 4 things going on. First, we are restraining the consumer demand for high carbon activities. Important to say that we have not done anything extreme in our assessments. We have not ended aviation. It still grows actually, but it grows more slowly than it would otherwise. We're not ending things like meat consumption, though we are cutting it back. And of course, alongside that, we have to become more energy efficient, more resource efficient, insulating lots of houses especially. Near term, over the course of this decade, 2025 to 2030, for example, demand reduction, energy efficiency is actually taking a really big share of the total reductions in emissions in our modelling. And of course, policy hasn't targeted those things very effectively to date. So that is a big challenge for the policy. I would say there are some easier wins in this particular bit of the strategy overall. Politicians may disagree. The second thing that we need to do of the 4 things is to expand our low carbon energy supply. So to finish the job on power, of course, we would say that needs to be done by the mid-2030s, but also growing our low carbon hydrogen supplies from almost nothing to something that's close to the size of the power sector today by 2050. The third element is the most important. Alongside all that energy shift and transition, we need to switch progressively to low carbon solutions. So especially electrifying. So electrifying heat, electrifying transport, and using hydrogen where electrification isn't an option. Also a bit of carbon capture in industry. This is the stuff that we will see and experience over the course of the next 20, 30 years. This is the electric cars. This is the heat pumps. This is the plant and machinery. This is the hydrogen technologies. By far, the most important challenge of all in this particular wedge is electrification. because it's generally the most efficient approach. It's also tends to be the cheapest approach in most cases. So that is a big part of this overall strategy, electrifying the economy. And the fourth element of the strategy is the kind of the net bit in net zero. That's the offsetting emissions, it's the natural carbon storage, it's the engineered greenhouse gas removals. They are absolutely essential because we can't get everything to actual zero emissions. But of course, they're a constrained option. We've got to think very carefully about how we use those offsets, not imagine for a second that you can just use a tree as you would a machine. We can't simply plant willy-nilly and offset our emissions elsewhere. So apart from anything else, climate change itself brings droughts and wildfires and makes those trees themselves, it brings them under a threat. So overall, it's the mixture of those four things that the government will be thinking about right now for its net zero strategy. It is primarily an investment challenge for the country, driven especially by the need to replace assets, which I think is a very straightforward outlook on this. The assets that we buy and use today that burn fossil fuels, the cars, the vans, the boilers, the plant machinery, I make no judgment at all about how to do this, but there is an iron law beneath this. If we want to achieve net zero, then we will have to progressively replace those high carbon assets with zero carbon alternatives over the course of the next 30 years, preferably as they come to the end of their useful economic life. So we avoid in doing that all the disruption and we minimize the capital scrappage. That is not contentious if you look at this. It's not meant to be a political statement, it's just a fact. But when I tell you that the average life of a fossil fueled asset bought today is between 15 and 20 years, I hope you start to see the urgency of acting on all this. The key date is not really 2050 at all, it's 2030. Because by then, UK infrastructure has got to be ready, UK energy networks have to be ready, UK citizens need to be at the starting line for this mass switchover of the capital stock of the country that's necessary for net zero. So that happens from around 2030. That means we're probably only one investment cycle from that kind of moment if we're going to make it on time. Now, I happen to think we'll do it, but it does require a pretty sober outlook on the challenge. So that is what needs to be achieved. Again, trying to be apolitical about it. Now the contentious bit, how can that be done? And let me start this section with a brief acknowledgement. For those of you on the right of the political spectrum, this can all sound a bit statey, a bit command and control. And I have a great deal of sympathy with that. And a statement, I suppose, which might seem obvious, but I will make it all the same. So far, the CCC, my organisation, is the only one that has offered a plan for net zero for the UK. We are required to do that by the Climate Change Act, and we have done so, I think, very thoroughly. By Jove, we've faced criticism for it from some quarters, but it is quite literally what we're required to do by law. And as you would expect from a technocratic organisation, it is a technocratic plan that we have presented to Parliament, pulled together by analysts, mainly based on techno-economic modelling. Let me say now, there is room for creativity here. There is room for political visioning on all of this. There is room for a different outlook on how to achieve it. Things will change and things will develop in unexpected ways in future years. Markets are going to pull through new technologies. I fully expect, in fact, I hope that our politicians are going to push back on the technocrats just as they should in the new net zero strategy. It's really important that they do. I mean, as we talk today, we are weeks away from seeing that strategy for net zero for the UK. And I hope it is the product of politics. The hustle and the tussle of ministerial debate around that cabinet table is really essential because they're going to have to own it. And I'm not going to bat an eyelid if ministers decide, as I suspect they will, that they take a different outlook on some of the difficult issues like consumer choice and diet change from what the modelling tells them. That is the point of the Climate Change Act. It says very clearly that targets must be met, that the CCC provides advice, but that ultimately it is the government, it's ministers who are responsible for delivery. And that is the way it should be. I expect to have something new to chew on in the next few weeks when we see that strategy. And I expect to have to go back to our own modelling to start revising the pathways to reflect that new strategy. That's exactly how this is supposed to work. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. It still stands. Ultimately, assets must be turned over. There is a need for some lifestyle change. I'm afraid that is inevitable over this. I would say it's at the margins, but it is necessary all the same. Jobs will be created in some areas, but some will also be lost. Choices must be made, and crucially, incentives need to be changed and offered differently. Carbon must be taxed. So I think this is a difficult moment for those who would like to see less state intervention. I understand that. And actually, I think that is probably one of the areas where I see the greatest need for some political creativity. Removing barriers to progress on decarbonisation is, I think, much harder than erecting new regulations and new taxes. But let's just see what happens. But interestingly, I think the fundamentals of what is needed from the policy package overall are refreshingly clear. Let me go through them. Firstly, work across the economy. We can't work in narrow sectors anymore. This is a genuinely integrated challenge. Put new policies in place that have a long-term outlook. That will help build confidence for some of the supply chains that we need, the installer community, for the changes that we need to see happen over the next 30 years. We need to stimulate the crucial investment in those capital assets I was talking about. Most of that will be private. We can do that at a cheap cost of finance if we get the long-term policies right. So we build that confidence amongst the financiers and the investors. Learn by doing. So bring down the cost for the consumer by allowing that kind of learning by doing innovation process to take place to bring down the cost of the key technologies. And finally, scale up deployment of those technologies when they are ready for the mass market. That takes time, and there is indeed inertia to overcome to make that happen. But I would argue that thinking about that 2030 date is the right anchor point. That's the point when we need to prepare the real economy to really deliver on this. That points to the coming decade as the really critical one for policymaking. It's after that, perhaps, that the state can step back a little, perhaps. So scaling up and then rolling out is the kind of mantra here. Scaling up in the 2020s, putting the new policies in place, be they regulations, standards, tax cuts, tax rises, public spending, whatever it is, the right mixture of policies, building the confidence, though, that the change out there is coming, then rolling out in the 2030s, the decade of deployment, really getting to that mass market rollout in every corner of the country on decarbonised heating, on transport, on farming, on land use change, on industry, on waste, on hydrogen, on carbon capture. The key challenge is that phase-out challenge I mentioned earlier. The fossil fueled assets, their life is 15 to 20 years. In most areas, we are entering that final investment cycle of fossil fueled assets. It can be done. And I think it's important to say that. How many of you listening to this today are considering an electric car to replace your diesel car right now? Things move fast. That was not the case just a few years ago. But by around 2030, our interest in buying fossil fueled assets and technologies does need to dwindle if we're going to make the 2050 target on time. And that is broadly the main challenge that policy will need to tackle when we see it in the next few weeks. And I think that points to the need to change the incentives for consumers and citizens. Fiscal policies, new information provision, something that can provide clearer signals to millions of people and corporates and businesses in the UK, shifting the incentives to favour low carbon options, tackling, of course, the barriers to deployment as well. All of that is possible, I think, if there is that creativity, that political creativity I talked about. And crucially, the evidence points to this transition being worth it, not just for the benefit of the climate, which of course is a big goal, if we and others pull this off, but also for the modernised industries we'll develop in the UK, for the wider health benefits that we'll see in this transition to the populace, for the necessary skilling up, genuine levelling up, quite literally, that we require in every town and city across the UK, for the improvements to the natural world that come with this, if we approach all this in the right way. And I think for that, I mentioned earlier, the greater degree of energy independence that net zero brings the UK, removing us from some potentially very nasty, very unpredictable fossil fuel import locations, bringing the GDP multipliers with that as we develop homegrown supplies of electricity and hydrogen. All of that is good. So let me turn finally to the economics of this in just the final section. And there is such a positive story of progress to tell here. I really feel it should be shouted. We should be shouting it from the rooftops. And I would love to see the Chancellor embrace this more explicitly. Firstly, if I can start on the macro questions, the UK is the demonstration that it is possible to decouple emissions and GDP growth. We are achieving that. That points globally to a transition to carbon neutrality that does not require the abandonment of growth and prosperity as measures of success. So we should be talking about that and pointing others to that situation that we face in the UK today. Secondly, though, and maybe more important actually, looking forward, innovation has really begun to deliver in some of the key technologies here. So some of the key low carbon technologies have massively benefited from that innovation process. And I have every expectation that will continue. The cost falls that we've seen, particularly in wind and solar energy, also the cost falls in battery technology, are absolutely stunning in recent years. As I mentioned, the levelized cost of those technologies is now well within the kind of range of fossil fueled electricity prices that we have today. Even when we build in the extra system costs of using those technologies at national scale, the need for more grid, the need for flexible backup generation that's low carbon, there's still a saving there. What's equally stunning is that those cost falls have been achieved in mechanical technologies as well as electronic technologies, something we didn't expect. We've seen huge progress in that three-bladed design for wind, for example, with the huge scale, especially that comes with those offshore machines that we expect now to be the backbone of the whole energy system in the UK. And we've seen progress on the electronics of solar PV and the chemistry of batteries, I would add into that as well. All of that is a recipe for enormous disruption. Schumpeter would be delighted with what he sees here. You don't need to care about climate change to be interested now in investing and deploying these zero carbon technologies. There is a reason why every major automotive factory is now moving away from internal combustion engine vehicles to battery electric. It's because they see the efficiency gains in the technology, they see the very positive consumer offer, they also see the savings in their own production lines because these things require fewer components. Now, the UK has led so much of this, and it's through a genuinely enlightened policy that that's happened. It's true, perhaps, that we could have secured more of that manufacturing supply chain in wind especially, but actually the high value parts of the value chain are here in the UK from offshore wind. The service, the system design is here, the financing of wind, the financing of green generally is here, all built, I would say, on a very sensible set of policies that supported innovation and built out at scale using auctions especially to bring the price down for the consumer over time. The lesson here is that markets work, but they do, of course, require a guiding hand from policy. We've seen those gains, particularly in the energy supply sector, but I don't know why we would think it would stop there. Why can we not see the same gains in the future from our burgeoning hydrogen sector? That promises to be a huge UK asset. Why can't we bring down the cost of low carbon heat technologies for the home in the same way as we've done for offshore wind? Why is the framing of this often so defeatist? I think we should try and change the record on this. I think the scale of the transition before us is such that, for me, that's what's exciting about it. We didn't blink in the past when we made these kind of national transitions from coal to town gas, for example, from town gas to North Sea gas. We made it a national priority. We were proud to see it through. I think the same can be true of the transitions before us. The transition to electric vehicles, the same transition that we've seen in offshore wind and the fall in cost is true of hydrogen, I think, in the future. That offers much greater energy security to the UK as well. The same can be true of the transition from gas in our homes to heat networks and to heat pumps, vastly superior technologies with far fewer mechanical failings, and offer in the future the prospect of cheaper energy costs if we get the policy environment right. So in our outlook, the CCC's outlook, published in December, we tried to bring together the analysis of the economics of this and the cost of this in a new analysis of the cost of net zero. That's the first time we've been able to do it in such an integrated way. In that modelling, we did not assume any dramatic changes in the cost of the key technologies. Offshore wind in our scenarios falls by just over 10% in price over the next 30 years, despite the fact we've seen prodigious falls prior to that. Nuclear is in there, it becomes 20% cheaper by 2050. Heat pumps fall by a third. Hydrogen production comes down in price too, but nothing radical. And I suspect we will see radical change in some of these key technologies, but we haven't assumed that. We also haven't assumed any radical changes in consumption. So there is a fall in meat consumption, but very much in line with what we're seeing already from younger people's diet. Air travel continues to grow, but not by as much, admittedly, as it would if it was unconstrained. We've also modelled a wide range of fossil fuel prices, which of course affect the relative costs of this transition. We looked at a range of fossil fuel prices from a decrease on 2019 levels of between 25 and 30% to an increase of 35 to 40%. And actually the lesson here is that the cost numbers we come up with are very resilient to changes in those underlying fossil fuel prices overall. And We even considered the cost of failing. So if we can't get sectors to zero emissions and we have to rely on expensive alternative options like greenhouse gas removals, then the costs still fall well within the envelope costs that were agreed by Parliament in the Climate Change Act debate in 2008. So what do we learn from all this coming to the end of this talk? Well, we need a lot of capital investment across the economy to get to net zero. We need to add probably around an 8 to total capex, total capital investment in the UK economy, and we need to maintain that over the course of the next 3 decades. That's an extra £50 billion a year of capex from 2030 onwards, most of it private. That's especially in the energy networks, energy supply, it's in buildings, it's in transport, and it's in the manufacturing industries. Those are the big capex challenges. And there is no getting away from that. There is a lot of investment costs that we would not be incurring as an economy if we were not aiming for net zero. But it can be financed cheaply with the right kind of long-term stable policies that will build investor confidence. That will deliver net zero, but crucially, it also has some other benefits. And this is the interesting part for me. Firstly, there's the benefit to the economy of using all those low carbon assets, the OPEX benefit. They tend to be much more energy efficient. They tend to be electrified. They tend to be powered by renewable electricity, increasingly over time. That falls in cost, certainly from about 2030 onwards. And we save as an economy because we're not spending on imported fossil fuels burned in inefficient devices. When we net off that OPEX saving from the CapEx numbers, we get a very low aggregate cost overall to the economy, less than 1% GDP in every year between now and 2050. And those OPEX savings grow over time. We also, though, get a host of benefits to health, to air quality, to the environment, which we haven't tried to price. But if you did, I'm certain would tip this into net positive territory even today as we look forward. So I think the aggregate story here of net zero is very, very positive indeed, even under our conservative assumptions. But, and there is a but, the other fact that really jumps out of our cost analysis is that the costs are not evenly spread, and neither are the benefits. There are regional impacts. There are a whole host of sectors with large costs that can't just be wished away, chief among them the cost of decarbonising buildings and the cost of decarbonising industry. And there are other sectors, happily, where decarbonisation brings savings. So the energy sector and the transport sector are the two obvious cases. So the task here, I would say, is primarily now a distributional one, capturing some of the savings in one area, spreading it to meet the costs in another. And for me, that makes this a classic fiscal challenge, and I hope one that the Chancellor will own if we're going to be successful. I think he will have to. I hope we will see that kind of ambition to change fiscal policies shortly. So stronger taxation of carbon, yes, but equally strong incentives to make the move to the greener alternatives. That can be done. A willingness to protect those consumers, whether they're individuals or corporates, from the costs that they cannot bear. And we can think with a clear head about those. We must not underestimate the scale of this challenge. I'll only observe that the Chancellor has 28 billion reasons to worry about the nation's move to electric vehicles. And that fiscal risk from dwindling fuel duty revenues is one that was created by the Prime Minister himself, with the commitment to phase out sales of petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. So above all, coming to the kind of final point here, I really hope that the narrative on the economy changes. We can, I think, move away from thinking of net zero as a kind of major cost overall. And increasingly, we can start to see this as a mission to modernize the economy. We can capture the benefits of that dynamic shift that other countries will be experiencing too. And I find that very compelling as a general take on where we are. And just finally, to return to my opening theme of global, the last 30 years on climate have not been entirely wasted. Of course they have. And I wish we had done more, of course, over the last 30 years. And yes, CO2 concentrations have continued to rise over that period. But we are now talking about climate outcomes more like 3 degrees centigrade of warming by the end of the century already. When the CCC began, in 2008, we were talking about the possibility of 5 degrees centigrade or even 6 degrees centigrade. So 2 degrees centigrade is now coming into view. That's the challenge for COP26, is to bring down that long-term temperature goal. The corridor for 1.5 degrees centigrade is still open, just about. That's thanks to the economic progress we've seen. We are moving away from coal. The economics point strongly towards clean energy as the best source in the future. The challenge globally is to pull off 5 or 6 key transitions, just peering beneath those national commitments we'll be talking about in November. It's coal phase out, it's phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles, it's industrial decarbonisation and hydrogen with it, it's carbon capture and storage, it's decarbonised heating and cooling in buildings, it's renewable and nuclear energy. I think genuinely the UK can model those changes now. And for me, that is the task for COP26, to demonstrate that we can do it, to demonstrate that we can capitalise on it too. And that is, I think, the strongest possible basis for a successful UK presidency of COP26. We shall see, Ted. So with that, I'll just say thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, what a fascinating speech. I mean, so wide-spanning, going from everything from the economics of this to what's required and how it can be done practically. I thought it was particularly interesting hearing about how you see there's room for more debate on these issues, and that you're almost pushing back against the government signing up to your own sixth carbon budget, which I thought was really interesting. And it sort of made me think about the need for sort of politically creative solutions to some of these things, especially from a sort of centre-right perspective. I think there's still lots of work to be done in this space. And then also finally looking at the economics of it, I thought was particularly interesting, and the sort of long-term gains potential, and that actually we just need to change the narrative a bit about how this is presented, which is going to be really important. But yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. And we've got lots of questions in the Q&A in the chat already, but I might just use my position as chair to ask you a question first, if that's all right. So I just picking one thing you were sort of speaking about here, heat pumps, for instance, is a very politically live issue at the moment. You often read about it in the press. And if you look at the CCC modelling, it's sort of up to 900,000 heat pumps a year needed by the end of the decade. And this is up from the sort of tens of thousands a year at the present. And I mean, there's a couple of things here. Firstly, how realistic do you think it really is to expect consumers to choose this technology, which is sort of more expensive and in some cases doesn't have the same usability and isn't as easy as a current boiler? And secondly, like really without just throwing enormous amounts of money at this, like what can the government do to drastically shift this? Like what we need to do to increase the diffusion of heat pumps is just the curve we need to go up is just monumental. I'd be really interested to know what kind of policy package also you would envisage. Sorry, Chris, I think I might have lost.
Hi, Ted. Can you hear me now?
Sorry, I can hear you now. So I don't know if it's just me.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, heat pumps have become the topic of the moment, haven't they? And that's not surprising, because it is such an important topic to discuss, changes in the home. But I don't think heat pumps are ready for the mass market just yet, but they could be, and that's the important thing. Now, first thing to say is the modelling points very strongly to their importance in this transition, because they use that green electricity that I talked about in my discussion. They use it very efficiently as well. But they are very expensive at the moment. I think there's no point ducking that. So there has to be a different kind of consumer offer. Partly, I think this is about the government offering some support for that, although I would say that's that's only one part of the answer here. Partly, it's about being clear about which parts of the country we would expect to move to heat pumps. There is a debate about which parts of the country potentially might use hydrogen, for example. I imagine many cities might move to something like a district heating network, which you find commonly on the continent. But there will be large parts of the country, particularly if they're off grid right now, that can use a heat pump. And for those properties, at the moment, the consumer offer is not where it should be. Partly because there is such a penalty to using the electricity for heat pumps in the consumer bill. So I think a big part of this is progressively over time, moving the balance of costs that currently sit on the electricity bill. The decarbonisation cost policies sit largely on the electricity bill, which is a slightly counterintuitive policy, because we're asking people to pay more for the thing we want them to use. So we need to shift that balance from electricity towards the fossil fuels that we don't want them to use. We can do that over time. And it's interesting that even small changes might make a big difference here. And they can, again, working with that asset replacement cycle, we're not talking about ripping out anyone's boiler. We're talking about calmly making a plan for the next 20, 30 years that sees us transition towards these things with those kind of incentives in place. And I mean, I'm really fascinated to see what the government comes up with here. We're expecting to see the government's heat and building strategy shortly. That seems to me is going to be one of the really big moments actually in this calendar. So it's perfectly possible to do that with heat pumps. And indeed, I think the consumer offer will be greatly enhanced by the commercial offering here. So we already know that we've got some of the big utilities warming up to offer that kind of much cheaper heat pump, potentially 50% cheaper than what you could buy in the market today. So I kind of hope that happens, and it won't happen unless there isn't a confident policy from the government around all of this.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And another one that has come up in the chat, which I'm particularly interested in, especially after your comments about sort of welcoming the challenge of some of this debate, is someone said, how do we respond to those skeptical, for instance, the net zero scrutiny group backed by the GWPF, for instance, and they sort of claim to be concerned about the cost of decarbonisation, but these are very much the same people which denied it just a few years ago. So I'd be interested to know what kind of reaction we should be having towards that side of the debate, and whether you welcome the challenge or you think it's sort of a negative force.
I mean, I don't mind saying some of it's been quite unpleasant for us, especially. But I mean, I think you have to welcome the debate that there is now about the cost of it, and if that results in a lower cost, then that's to the benefit of everyone. But I think the answer to your question is that we need to open up to rational discussion all the things that I've just talked about in my speech. So there are some fundamentals here about what needs to be done overall. There are lots of uncertainties though about how to achieve it. And there will be ways to do it more cheaply and ways to do it more expensively. And I think it's great to have that kind of discussion. But as long as we're doing it in that rational sense, then I think there can be nothing wrong with that, really. But I will make the point again that I made in my speech that net zero is a fundamental. It's a scientific fundamental. So I think as long as we have that goal in mind, then we can open up the space for the political debate about how best to achieve it. And I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. And all we are doing in the CCC is pointing to the kind of technical pathways that deliver it. Again, politics can decide whether those are the pathways that we follow.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's sort of been an interesting moment because I think for too long we had a sort of complete consensus on net zero, and it's almost any issue that is any political issue that has sort of complete consensus is inevitably going to have some opposition rise up at some point. So I don't think it's wholly a bad thing. Moving on, I've got a question here from Hilary Bowman as well, who sort of picks up on the domestic heat debate, and she's sort of interested here in the hydrogen option, really, and will it be available to the 10 to 20% of buildings, and how it could feed into this. So sort of thinking back, I remember a minister talking about how by 2027 we'll have hydrogen running through the pipes, and I sort of was slightly skeptical, but I'd be interested in your opinion, really, on the potential for hydrogen and which sort of homes we would be wanting to use it for.
Well, there's undoubtedly potential here, and indeed we recognise that in all the analysis that we've done. But we are cautious about saying that it's the answer. I mean, I don't think there is a single answer for any of the challenges that we've talked about today. But when it comes to domestic heat, especially, hydrogen has a role potentially, but it needs to be demonstrated. And of course, it's up against a set of technologies that have already been demonstrated quite extensively in other places. So this is a kind of a decade really where we will understand better, I suppose, the role that hydrogen could play. In technical terms, it can be done. You know, you can turn over the transmission and distribution networks to hydrogen if you think carefully about how to design those networks. It looks increasingly from the safety analysis that's been done that the hydrogen can be piped into the home and used. It looks that way. We need to demonstrate that is the case. But the key question for me is, where does the hydrogen come from? Hydrogen is, as everyone will know, the most abundant element in the universe, but you've got to create it. And that's the key thing, is it's got to come from somewhere. Now, it is possible to create zero carbon hydrogen, of course, with green hydrogen. We've had that debate now about the green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen. It is possible to do it using fossil fuels to capture the carbon, albeit that's not a zero carbon process. But the crucial thing is that both of those carry penalties. If you're using green hydrogen, you need a very, very, very extensive power system to generate all that hydrogen that you're using. If you're using blue hydrogen, you need to continue to use fossil fuels and capture as much carbon as you can of it. So I don't think it's possible to look to a world where we are turning over every property to a hydrogen boiler in the future. I also don't think it's sensible to do that. I also think that's a very expensive way into this. In our modelling, between 10 and 20% of properties is about the right kind of figure, Ted. You used that. But again, that's just technical modelling. I think a lot of this will come down to the consumer preference, potentially to the politics. Who am I to say that the good people of Teesside shouldn't use hydrogen as a source for their domestic heat if their jobs locally depend upon the production of hydrogen? So those kind of factors, I think, come into play. For me, the key thing, and I'm very happy to make this point, is not really the underlying economics of this, nor the underlying question of supply. It's actually the need for a plan. So what we need is we need to have a stronger sense regionally about what the plan is for heat decarbonisation, because it will vary across the country. I'm speaking to you today from Glasgow, the city of Glasgow. This would be a great candidate for a citywide heat network. So instead of gas networks, we would have hot water pipes, as you find commonly in Scandinavia, for example. That would not be a huge disruption to my life if once the pipes are down there, I'd have a heat exchanger instead of a gas boiler. I think we need to open up some of the options here to have more of a public debate about what people want and form more of a plan, especially that regional plan I talked about, because otherwise we are going to struggle to make national infrastructure investment decisions over the course of the next few years. Ofgem, the energy regulator, is going to struggle to sign off on investment plans from the energy networks unless we know what the plan is for heat decarbonisation across the country. So for me, that's another thing to look out for from the heat and building strategy. And yes, hydrogen almost certainly will have a role in that, but we'll have to work out what that is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And we've got another question here from Jonathan Watts from The Guardian, who's asked, why are you making this speech now? And are you concerned that scepticism and price concern argument has been making ground in recent weeks, particularly in the right-wing press? And he's asking, is this speech intended to sort of stiffen the resolve of the government? I will caveat his response with, we put this in quite a long time ago, so yeah, I guess a bit of this, but I'd be interested to get your take anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's the answer, because they asked me to do it, I think is the answer, Jonathan. But I'm very happy to make it. I think it is a good point to just kind of to make a speech like this, actually, just to remind everyone that I think there is an achievable transition here, but that there is a need for some real political thought on it. And I don't think it's our place to make those political judgments. So I suppose today what I hope to do is just remind everyone that we have the technical analysis of 5 different ways to get to net zero. I don't really have any question that there are many different ways to do this, but what we lack, of course, is now the decisions about those technical pathways, the political decisions. And I think that's what we need now. So I am looking forward to seeing what is in this net zero strategy. I don't know what it will say. There are some big decisions to be had in there. I think the most uncertain part of that is what the Treasury says about it. And I think it is absolutely essential that what we have at the end of this is a net zero plan that is endorsed by the Chancellor, because those fiscal policies, especially the decisions that he will make in the spending review, are completely critical to the success of the strategy overall. And we cannot keep kind of inching our way forward on all this. The kind of incremental change that we're seeing in some of the policies that we've seen over the last 12 months is not going to cut it. So it feels like a big moment, and of course that moment is coming before COP26, there'll be a lot of focus now on what that strategy contains.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. And there's a few questions in the chat about sort of carbon pricing more broadly, and how Jenny does sort of talks about how we should be sort of incentivizing rail use over aviation. And I'd just be interested to know what kind of mechanisms you see, or what kind of sort of trying to tackle the price of things, either whether it be a carbon price or using it through VAT. I'd be just really interested to know how you think we could try and tilt incentives to sort of try and rebalance carbon prices to be a bit more representative of their carbon input.
Yeah, and I don't have an easy answer to that, Ted, but what I will say is if you look across the various ways in which a price or a proxy price is put on carbon at the moment, it's a mess. So you can see that we haven't really got a coherent plan for carbon pricing across the economy, and that's because it's grown up organically. Issues like fuel duty, for example, they're not really carbon prices; they're a proxy for a carbon pricing mechanism. And yet in other areas we see real carbon pricing taking place. I don't know whether you need something fundamental as a full review, but I do think it demands some proper thought, and I have to hope the Treasury is doing that work. And they have promised, of course, a review of the funding of all of this, which I would expect to cover some of this. It is obvious that carbon pricing has a stronger role to play. And it is fairly obvious to me, at least, that the Chancellor has some options at his disposal to use it, especially if he wants to raise revenue in some areas. But it can't just be about pricing carbon. I think the other part of the equation matters immensely too. The question of how you avoid a regressive outcome from that carbon pricing is really central. And I don't just mean at the level of the individual consumer, I mean also about corporates. We have trade exposed industries who will struggle to bear the costs of decarbonisation without some form of government support. And I think for me, that's the relevance again of having a slightly longer term outlook from the Chancellor and from the government proper in its net zero strategies, that we should be able to see the principles that will be applied over the course of the next few years, a stronger sense of a strategy unified with the fiscal tools. And we haven't really had that. In fact, I don't think we've ever had it from the Treasury. We've never had that kind of fundamental appraisal of the economics of climate change and net zero here in this country. And the irony of that is, of course, that the Treasury was behind the global review of economics that was done by Nick Stern all those years ago. This is the time, I think, to start looking at the domestic plans for net zero and applying some of those economic lessons. And I'm really optimistic about our ability to come up with something good there.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. No, that is really interesting. I was just looking at the time. We've probably got time for one more question. There's a few questions in the chat about innovation and how we should be dealing with sort of net zero innovation. But I've got a question of my own that sort of relates to that I think I just was going to ask, which is, so recently you see Dominic Cummings has recently admonished green campaigners for trying to shut down discussion of certain technologies, such as sort of like direct air capture, carbon removal technologies, and fusion, for instance. And their argument is that it creates an excuse for inaction. And I'd be interested to know your opinion on who's really right in that debate. So should we be betting on innovation or opting for what we know works already?
Again, it's not an easy answer to that question, but I mean, clearly we need both. But I think the terms of this discussion have changed recently. So, I mean, just to deal with the specific issue of those technologies that might offer some massive kind of black swan event, game-changing point. I mean, I would love that. I would love to see fusion come along. I would love to see direct air capture at a really cheap price. And if we get that, I think that will really help. But we are not going to get that in the kind of timetable that we're talking about here for net zero. And there is a sort of ticking clock here, again, laid out by the IPCC. So what's shifted is that. Now, we need to support those technologies because they have a role. I would say the role is to offer the opportunity to go even faster on this transition that we've talked about today. But we also know that there are a set of technologies that will work, or at least hold the prospect of working now. And actually, the challenge of developing those technologies, deploying them at scale, is the thing that we need to focus on, I think, for the next decade especially. There is no great secret, actually, to decarbonising the whole of the economy. Mostly, we have the technical knowledge to do it. We should be getting on with it, would be my take, bringing down the cost as quickly as possible, and then benefiting from these technologies as they come on. It's not that we're excluding them. In fact, just to deal with direct air capture, which tends to be one of the most expensive technologies in our assessment, we've got it in there. So it's doing a megaton of direct air capture by 2050. And the reason we do that is because, yes, it's expensive, but it's something that's worth developing. So we should have it in there in the mix. And Dominic Cummings is right about that. But we can't rely on it because it will not deliver us net zero on the timetables that we require. So let's think of it instead as an additional tool in the armory. And yes, let's support it, but let's get on with the more mundane job of actually rolling out those technologies that we already have.
Fantastic, thank you, Chris. And it's about a minute until the end of the session, so I think I'm going to call it there. But thank you so much for coming today. And I think I speak for everyone to say it was a really fascinating discussion, and great to have you here. And hopefully we'll have you for a speech again soon. And thank you everyone for joining the event. And